As part of its campaign to show a more open side, the Chinese government has set aside 3 areas in Beijing for public protests during the Olympics. The government said that so long as people obtained approval and followed the rules, then demonstrations will be allowed. I decided to test the limits of free expression in China today. I decided to apply to hold a protest. I went along to the Beijing Public Security Bureau together with a Times video journalist. After some discussion with some officials there, they led us deep into the heart of the public security building. We've come to a branch of the Beijing Public Security Bureau to apply for a permit to hold a demonstration here in Beijing. They took our IDs, they interviewed us about our purpose, and then they kind of disappeared and left us in this anteroom. For the next hour or so, the police went over the protest law in laborious detail. The application has to list the name list of everybody who shows up, along with their identity card documents. And if there are any Chinese nationals on that list, they have to show up at the Public Security Bureau in person to be approved. The protest zones have been almost completely empty during the Olympics. I can't find any evidence that any single protest has actually been allowed. The Beijing Public Security Bureau had this incredible infrastructure. What it didn't actually have was a real system to actually tolerate protests. One can argue that this is a completely meaningless exercise, but I do think that in a Chinese context, it is a measure of progress. The Olympics have become a window into modern China and a litmus test of human rights and political protest and political freedom in China today. The kind of news that gets the attention from China tends to be the arrest of dissidents or the crackdowns on Tibetans, and those are real and should be condemned. But there's also a larger truth that we shouldn't lose sight of. If you compare China today to China a half dozen years ago, the great majority of people have far more personal space than they ever did before. Ordinary people don't need to get permission to move to a different city, to find a new job, to marry. China does have a lot of freedom to let people live their lives the way they want to. This isn't that the government has expanded freedom intentionally. It's really more that people have grabbed that freedom and the society has changed. The middle class has grown so that freedom has accrued without it actually being granted. I think in the West, people sometimes have the impression that China is this country seething with dissent, where dissidents are grabbed and tossed into jail, and it's so much more complex than that. There are indeed a lot of people who are very upset about corruption, about mismanagement, and yet one recent poll looked at people all around the world and found that those in China were actually the most content. You can't mistake it for a democracy, but you also can't mistake it for what existed 5 or 10 years ago. I think it's important for Westerners to maintain the criticism and push for greater human rights within China. But it's just as important to acknowledge that there really has been progress and that the China of today is not the same as the China of a decade ago.